Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session today. My name is Charles Clark. I'm the Senior Director of Solution Architects for the Americas region here at Veeam. I'm joined by my good friend, Raymond Goh.
Hi, Charles, and hi, everyone. I'm Raymond Goh, running a system engineering team for APJ.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining me today, Raymond. This is going to be a fantastic session. We're just going to have a conversation about the Veeam data platform, some of the capabilities, and why those capabilities are so important for our partner ecosystem. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start by sort of putting you on the spot a little bit with a question that, we get asked plenty. But if I'm an organization and I'm looking at my overall security posture, and I've bought front-end protection, I've bought anti-malware scanning, I've got, all my firewalls, network security, all that sort of stuff. I also have, a backup solution. Maybe I'm using Veeam as my backup solution. I think I'm good. I'm all set, right? Like I've bought Veeam backup and replication. That's all I need. Am I done?
Charles, I usually hate to disappoint you, right? But I think that's far from good from my point of view, as well as talking to a lot of our customers out there who has the misconception that when I have the front end protection, I'm good enough, right? I'm all protected, right? But in actual fact, you're probably far from being well protected. I'll probably state use case over here from a lot of our financial sector customers. I believe it applies to all industry, right? So the recent use case will be there's a financial institution that leverage a lot on the secure tertiary data protection backup, right? STDB governance, right? And they use that model. And our team kind of went in to do a risk and gap assessment from a data protection perspective. Obviously, they do a lot more with the rest of the other networking aspects as well as security aspects, right? And with that, we found there's quite a lot of gaps in terms of not just from a front end side, but also from back end to your last line of defense from a backup perspective, right? And the customers can look at all the gaps analysis and they are into that ring defense of endpoint at the edge as well as the core data centers. And at every of this ring, they do have a restoration planning, a validation process, and the drills to come by, right? So, and they break down into the different degree of failure. Example, if I got 25% of failure, what should I be doing? 50% of failure, what is that SLA from recovery standpoint? Right down to even 100% failure, right? What should be the process? And they need to test this quarterly against characteristic under their principles or guidelines as secure, assurance, and high performance courses, right? So these are the things that we have been hearing from the customers, which is, answering to your question, right? I hope that helps in letting our audience know over here is definitely not enough just to have the front end protection over there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's sort of interesting. I think the way, like what, I was chatting with the leaders of our support organization recently, and they were sharing that, Veeam has, almost, about 500,000 customers globally. Of course, our customers, like all customers, have front-end data attacks, ransomware attacks, malware attacks. So they were sharing some of the stats, how often we deal with these, and it's not insignificant. I mean, it's a few a week, attacking the front-end data. And of course, we have a support SWAT team that helps them, use Veeam to recover, so we can recover their data very quickly, help them not pay the ransom, all those kind of good things. But what we sort of realized as we work with those customers is that there's not really any defense. I mean, you can dissuade attackers, and you can certainly make your environment look less attractive, and certainly close off some attack vendors. But I think in terms of having an absolute, sort of complete, we're totally protected, I think those days are sort of behind us now. I think, not that ransomware attackers are necessarily always a step ahead, but certainly a lot of the innovative attacks and, exploiting, human weaknesses, social engineering, those kind of things mean that everyone has to be ready for a rainy day.
Yeah.
The other thing you mentioned there that I think was kind of interesting was the kind of testing regimen as part of the standards you were talking about there. One of the challenges that I see our customers have is, how do I do that testing en masse? How do I do it in bulk? And then how do I report against it in a way that speaks to governance within the organization and also compliance? So I mean, compliance is kind of a key reason to look at the entire Veeam data platform rather than just VBR in itself. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about that and some of the sort of compliance trends that you've seen?
Yeah. So, yep, I started off with the compliance, right? And STDB, yep, just to reiterate, right? Secure tertiary data backup is just one of the compliance that we are looking at. There are multiple compliance across the different industry, right? Take, for example, the Essential 8 for the Australia government, right? As well as the MAMPU, the governance in Malaysia side, who has their ICT security handbook, and Singapore, right? MAS, they have their technology risk management, TRM. And with all this compliance or regulation and guidelines, we do see some commonalities. It's across the board, right? Whether you're in the government or you're in the financial sectors, it still applies, right? And some of these principles that we do hear from our customers, there's usually a huge challenge apart from the governance that I spoke about earlier on, right? You'll be things like, how do we profile and identify critical data? Okay, making sure that which are the data that falls under the right SLA. There's also the aspects of data quality that comes into the picture, the integrity of data, not just on the production end, but also when it comes to the backup end where Veeam does. What's the integrity of data when it comes to recoverability and so on, right? There's also that critical data lifecycle that customers wanted to understand. Where does your data sit and which tier is it sitting, right? It could be on-prem, it could be at the edge, it could be on DR, it could be on the cloud. And there's also one key part whereby that relates into the data extraction and ingestion, right? How do you extract the data, especially from Veeam perspective, when you're doing the backup? How do we extract the data in a secure way for restoration planning, as well as restoration validation process and drills, right? So I think these are the common aspects from a principles of the regulated guidelines perspective. And they do have certain characteristics where they call data vault characteristics and a couple of things, right? We have been talking to our customers in regards to cyber threat attacks, right? Immutability, air gap. It has to be secured. It has to have assurance, right, in terms of the recovery, as well as you mentioned, the mass recovery, high performance recovery to get back your data on time, right? So yeah, that's what we've been hearing on the field. Yep.
Yeah, I think the reporting aspect of that is something that, you know, as someone in a past life was involved in this, I think for our partners and for our customers, reporting against that so you can demonstrate to government organizations where you are in that journey is really important. And you spoke there about data locality. I think that data locality reporting and you know, transparency applies to backup data as well. So, you know, of course, you will have backup data most likely on-prem. You might have backup data in a secondary data center, backup data in the cloud. So how is that being tiered? Are you providing for offsite recovery and those kind of things, and how you're reporting that? It's interesting, you know, you mentioned the Australian laws there. Here in the US, we have the Security and Exchange Commission, obviously. So the SEC actually just this year implemented a number of rules around reporting in the face of kind of cyber resiliency, really as a kind of response to ransomware. And there were a couple of key things they did. I mean, first of all, they already had guidance around disaster recovery planning and having a published disaster recovery plan. That came into effect actually after Hurricane Sandy sort of hit the East Coast in 2012. But this year, big change was made, I think it was in June, where they now require companies to disclose whether or not they've had a cyber attack. So the reporting and the auditing and the forensics of that suddenly become important because you're government mandated to provide information about it. The other thing that went along with that piece of guidance for SEC registered companies is that they require annual reporting of their cybersecurity risk mitigation. Now, if you're a partner for Veeam, you know, how do you help your customer through that? Like, how do we, you know, how do you sort of how do you make that automated so that it's not an onerous task for the customer? How do you make it so that as a partner, it's an easy sort of turnkey service? And I think this speaks to the data platform because, of course, within the data platform, beyond VBR, Veeam Recovery Orchestrator will allow us to produce automated reporting on DR and recovery plans. And of course, Veeam One has a whole host of reports around, cyber resiliency, what your security profile looks like. We have the new security dashboard, which looks, fantastic, and is something that could be used to comprise part of those reports. So I think that reporting in the face of that legislation to meet compliance is all important, really. I mean, from sort of outside of compliance for government, I mean, are you seeing any trends within organizations in terms of the internal reporting that they have to do, or sort of how they're addressing that? Like, what's sort of resonating with Veeam customers when they ask for reporting and alerting and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I think that's crucial too from a documentation standpoint for the internal aspects of things, right? That's where, example, right, disaster recovery, business continuity planning from an orchestration standpoint. I think that's for internal reporting and internal auditing. They will need to provide those information to the external too, right? To make sure that the data quality is there, the data privacy has been kind of filtered off. Necessary information has to be sent publicly across, right? And what we have encountered is there are a couple of characteristics of these reports that is tying to, right? As mentioned earlier on, one of the principles of the STDB is based on survivable, right? When your data is in, how do I have the documentation to make sure that my data or my business can survive in a sense whereby my data can be restored or can be recovered, right? From without the need of a intermediary functions, it has to be as fast as possible. Data retrieval does not rely on kind of an infrastructure, right? Like my infrastructure is gone, right? And then I have to restore it to the cloud. Any means of restoring and getting my data up, right? So there's one of the reporting and documentation that's required. The other part is more on the secure side of things, whereby there has to be adequate preventive controls, example, access control and management, right? How do you audit that? How do you report who are the one is able to access? A bit of detective controls over there with log monitoring and real-time alerts coming in, right? All these kind of reportings come into the picture. It can be a huge log collection that we're looking at, together with documenting the processes to be in place to protect the, as mentioned earlier on, confidentiality of data, the integrity of data, as well as, most importantly, that's why we do best, the availability of your data when you need to recover them, right? So that's what we have been hearing quite a fair bit when it comes to the documentation internally and externally.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, with the data platform, the automated reports inside in Veeam One and inside Recovery Orchestrator make that kind of less of an onerous task and actually provide something turnkey for our partners. Actually, one of my favorites, when you're talking about data survivability, working with a customer recently, and they, a common sort of ransomware attack is to encrypt data stores. We've seen that actually across a number of different customers with ransomware. So if a set of data stores gets encrypted on a given cluster or set of clusters, do I still have the compute inside my organization to run my workloads elsewhere and internally without necessarily having to recover to the cloud? Of course, with Veeam that is an option. So Veeam One does provide that sort of insight. So it's kind of an interesting way of looking at capacity planning. You think about capacity planning as, I'm going to grow and expand. Well, no. You also have to think about capacity planning in terms of failover, and is there enough compute to run workloads when I have a rack of servers that are behind sort of yellow CSI tape, right? They're being investigated by the FBI. But so I wanted to put, you spoke about data survivability there. One of the key elements sort of within the data platform, and certainly something that I'm passionate about, is orchestration. I love the thought of the sort of Captain Kirk chair, where everything sort of gets orchestrated from a single point. What are you seeing in the market in terms of that sort of mass recovery motion in the face of ransomware? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the big part about orchestration is to avoid that human error prone, right? Things that are repetitive and can be of a high percentage of success, right? I think that's the basic requirement that's required, right? Especially as mentioned earlier on, the customers that we work with, right? When it comes to a smaller disaster, right? 25% of their data has been compromised. Probably you can selectively restore certain data, but you should know where your data is and where it's being recovered from and recovered to, right? So I think that's fine. But when it comes to a larger aspects, right, where ransomware comes to the picture, and then based on our trend, our latest data, our ransomware trend report, right? more than 50% of your data is being compromised. More than 50% of your infrastructure is offline, right? So when it comes to that sort of disaster, a well orchestrated with full automation, as well as scripted methodology at backend will be of utmost importance, right? And as well as practice, obviously the practice of things where the documentation that we spoke about.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of customers are facing a lot of challenges when it comes to the orchestration. They are not too sure what are preceding step when ransomware attack, right? And you're unfamiliar of what to do, right? And the worst thing that you want to get is you miss out a step and then you reintroduce back your ransomware, or in the end you paid the ransom, which is not what we want to do, right? We never want to pay the ransom. We recover the data. Yeah.
Right. This is it. I mean, practice makes perfect in any recovery plan. And if you've got an automated or orchestrated way to practice that, when you do have to do a recovery, then your chances of success are higher. You know, the thing that really sort of strikes me, and one of the reasons I'm passionate about Orchestrator is really kind of one word, is time. Because in the case of a ransomware attack, time is absolutely critical. Time to recovery is critical because, of course, the longer your data remains encrypted, or the longer it's out of action, the more your customer starts to consider, paying. At what point does paying the ransom become an option versus not? So, for me, having an orchestrated, tested approach where it basically becomes, the big green button that I push, and then I bring data back, is key. And we've seen customers in the past where, they've had a large volume of their data encrypted, and they're looking at the cost of doing that recovery. And even with a backup solution, like Veeam, if you don't have a sort of well-documented, well-orchestrated plan for doing that, just physics. It just takes time to put stuff back. And if someone is sitting there sort of mouse clicking or has to script something up to be able to do recoveries en masse, obviously that adds to that time, and that clock is constantly ticking on ransomware in terms of where the value point is and of paying the ransom or not paying the ransom. So if you've got the ability, when an attack happens, and I think it's a when, not an if, unfortunately, these days, if you've got the, when an attack happens, you've got the ability to say, all right, just undo, put everything back. And we know that those backups are clean. We know that they're not infected because we've used, inline scanning and all the other sort of capabilities inside the data platform, doing that recovery, saves time, saves money, prevents the payment of the ransom, and is really kind of, it offers a lot of value.
Yeah, and one point to add on, and one more challenge to add on. A lot of customers are looking into not just recovery into in their own disaster recovery site, but also to recover into the cloud per se. So it's kind of hybrid cloud environment, multi-cloud environment. If the orchestration and our orchestration is able to do that, relevant workloads into your offsite data center, private data center, as well as certain workloads moving into the cloud, right? So I think that also requires a fair bit of orchestration to be done to make sure that rightful workloads are in the right location for you to be back in business, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I mean, in Recovery Orchestrator, we can do planned orchestrated failovers into Microsoft Azure, right? So we have that kind of cloud scenario, covered there. Okay, Raymond, I think we're up on time here, but what an absolutely fantastic chat. Thank you very much for joining us today. And
thanks, Charles.
Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.